It's time to wire things up and start using our artifacts to accelerate our project delivery process. For this part, it's highly recommended to have a set of themes or a basic structure written down, even if it's just on a sheet of paper. That way, you'll have a clear mental picture of how your project development is going to look. In this outline, we only need high-level ideas, a general overview. We'll soon turn those ideas into actionable steps, also known as user stories or your product backlog. Even while creating the user stories, it's helpful to have a notebook, a digital document, or even just a piece of paper to keep your thoughts organized and your process smooth. We're going to use a fictional example, a simple branding project. It's not a real one, so don't focus too much on the details. It may not perfectly align with how a real branding project works. This is purely for demonstration purposes, to show you the power of applying Scrum inside GitHub. All right, let's start by defining our themes. First, in our repository, let's go to the Issues tab and click New Issue. Here, you'll see the templates we created earlier, and now everything starts to make sense. Select the user story template. We'll need to give it a title, following a consistent naming convention that we'll reuse across all future user stories. In our case, we'll simply use user story in capital letters, followed by a descriptive title. Since we don't have specific details yet, we'll start with the theme title from our project outline. For our fictional project, we'll begin with that. Then, click Create. Congratulations, you've just created your first issue on GitHub. That's a big step forward in mastering your workflow. Let's take a look at the result for a moment. Here we can see the user story metadata, the description that explains how to write our sentences, the acceptance criteria, the tasks section where we can break down our story into smaller parts, and finally, a few useful notes. Remember, in the agile philosophy, nothing is fixed or deterministic. Many of the processes described here are flexible. You can add or remove elements whenever it helps improve your workflow. I recommend starting with the structure shown here, and then gradually adapting it to your own needs and preferences as you gain experience. Now, let's click on the three dots in the upper right corner and select Edit. This allows us to modify our user story at any time. For now, there isn't much to change. I'll just edit the theme section and click Save. Our focus now shifts to the right-hand side of the screen. Here, I'll assign myself to this issue and add the corresponding labels. In this case, we'll select Theme. Then, under Milestones, we'll also choose Theme. We're going to repeat this same process for all our themes. I'll do it silently while you watch the steps. Perfect. These are our themes, now created and connected with at least one label and one milestone. Our next task is to refine these themes into detailed user stories, and eventually, into actionable tasks. Next, we'll open each theme and begin creating the user stories for it. The goal here isn't to be perfectly precise, but to define the key actions we need for this project. We have our helper right here, the format that shows how to write each user story sentence. For example, as a designer, I want to define the client's briefing based on our first communication, so that I can gather valuable data that allows me to develop a proper and complete branding. That's just an example. Now, I'll do the same silently and continue defining a few more user stories as tentative entries. Once I've gathered all the user stories, I save them and continue with the rest of the themes. Perfect. That was quite a bit of brainstorming. Now we need to take our refinement one step further, because each of these themes still hides some additional work beneath the surface. Based on the tentative user stories we've created, we're now going to create epics. I'll leave our first theme page open and start creating new user stories one by one. This time, I'll take each user story we wrote in our first theme and turn it into an epic. Enjoy watching the process. As you can see, I'm adding the corresponding label, epic in this case, and assigning each one to the epic milestone. Once I'm done with the first theme, I simply scroll down and click Close Issue. That's it. Very easy. Now, if we go back to the Issues page, you'll notice that the theme is no longer listed there. It's been moved to the Close section. That's actually a good sign. Let's see why that matters. If we go to Milestones and scroll down to Theme, you'll see a progress bar. That bar shows how close we are to completing all the items under that milestone. The milestone progress bar only updates when we close an issue. That's GitHub's way of signaling that a task has been completed and it's time to move forward. We'll repeat this same process with all the themes, and keep an eye on how the milestone progress bar updates. By the end of this process, you'll have only user stories labeled as epic. However, these epics aren't fully actionable yet. They still need to be refined further. Let's begin refining them one by one. At this stage, we need to reread each user story and ask ourselves, is this story clear enough? Does it define a single, specific task? If the answer is no, if it feels too broad, then we need to break it down into smaller user stories or separate issues. If it's clear and specific enough, we can move on to the metadata. We already know the theme, so we'll update the title based on what we have in the epic. We'll also review and refine the user story itself, maybe rewrite it to make it clearer. I'll just copy and paste mine for now. Perfect. This epic no longer functions as an epic. It's time to change its label to brief and move it to the brief milestone as well. You may have noticed that I didn't close this issue. I simply reused it and changed its status. That's completely normal and actually much more convenient. This user story is now getting closer to being ready for the project board. Now, I'll continue doing the same with the rest of the epics. By the end of this step, we should only have user stories with the brief status. That looks great. At this point, we can start to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Our next task is to refine each issue once again and move them to the final user story stage. We'll go through each entry carefully, refining the acceptance criteria, the tasks, and finally assigning a story point value based on the modified Fibonacci sequence. I'll perform this process silently so you can follow along. Perfect. Now, we'll update the labels. Notice the big changes here. We've assigned each user story to a sprint and linked it to the final milestone. If we scroll down, we'll find a logging section. Yes, GitHub automatically tracks all recent activity related to each issue. That's extremely useful for both you and your team. If needed, I can also add a comment here to document progress or notes. I'll keep creating more user stories. Stay with me until the end. Beautiful. Now we have a set of refined user stories, each one with story points representing its difficulty level, proper labels, and connections to both milestones and the project board. If we return to milestones, we can now see how many user stories belong to each stage, whether they're open or closed. That's very satisfying to watch. Next, let's go to the project section and select our sprint. And there you go. Your user stories are ready to be dragged across different stages whenever you begin development. Notice how I decided which user stories belong to which sprint. This is important because it allows me to estimate how long each iteration or sprint will take, using the modified Fibonacci scale. I prioritized them based on importance and feasibility, and sometimes simply by logical order, according to what should be done first. The goal here is to have every task clearly defined and organized into manageable blocks, in this case, sprints. All that's left now is to decide when to start working on your first sprint. For example, if I open my first sprint again, I can move stories into the ready stage. From there, I can easily move them into in progress once I begin working. This way, I'm signaling to myself and to anyone collaborating that the work has started. For each user story, my responsibility is to mark the subtasks as completed once they're done, and to add comments or notes when needed. When a user story is complete, I can move it to done and close the issue. As you can see, the board updates automatically. And if I go back to issues and then milestones, I can clearly track our progress across all user stories. Depending on the size of your project, you may find that setting up Scrum in GitHub takes a bit of time at first. But once it's done, it becomes incredibly efficient, and you can easily reuse the same artifacts in future projects. That's what makes GitHub such a powerful project administration hub for your business operations and professional work. In our next video, we'll learn about estimation and team velocity using the story points we've gathered so far. I hope you enjoyed this intensive lesson. See you in the next one.